Hello, and welcome to Red Rock Relationships, a podcast about communication. Let's unpack the relationships that we encounter in our daily lives and learn about what makes them tick. And now your host for Red Rock Relationships, Dr. James B. Stein.
All right, how we doing? It's another week, which means another edition of Triple R, and I am your host, James. It's great to be here in the studio. Yet again, big shouts out to Sean and the folks at Radio Dixie 91.3 for supporting us in this effort. We are moving right along in our journey to discuss the most important issues of our relationships. And today we've settled on a big one. We're going to be talking about emotions. And then, of course, as we progress, we are eventually going to come to a point where we talk about the outcomes of those emotions. And those are sort of for the next couple of episodes coming up. But I am thrilled to introduce my guest for this week's installment. He's a good friend of mine and a colleague, soon to be Dr. Lance Bennett. Lance, how we feeling today?
Pretty good, man. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do it. And, you know, like I said last week, half the guests are just people who I met in grad school. And you're another one of those good folks. But it just so happens that you have a very special expertise in an area that happens to be very important to the issues that we talk about on this podcast. But, you know, before we get to all that, I do want to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself to our listeners, explain who you are, where you come from, and where your area of expertise lies. So take it away.
Yeah. So Lance Bennett, currently an adjunct professor of communication at St. Edward's University, and I'm completing a doctorate of education in higher ed leadership. And so also at St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas. And so I'm originally from Philadelphia, Northeast in the building. And so part of my expertise from communication is with emotion and this idea of emotional contagion that we can catch and spread our emotions to other people.
Yeah, and you know, your work on that is what initially drew us together because our listeners may not know this, but my particular area of expertise and interest is in the ways in which our social networks influence how we go through our relationships. And the connection between that interest and your interest is going to be clear here in just a moment. But one other quick little thing that I want to mention, being that you're from the Philly area, you and I are really the only two people in my world right now who are familiar with the term Jawn, Jawn, which is, of course, a noun, a verb, an adjective.
It's everything.
It's nice to be able to, and one of these days on this show, we'll probably talk about slang and how developing the sort of same slang as another person is a very intense way of bonding, but that's going to be for another day. So we are talking about emotions, and specifically we're going to be talking about emotional contagion, which is a phrase that some folks listening may not necessarily be familiar with. But before we do that, we need to do our due diligence and just talk about emotions in general. So Lance, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about the power of emotions, what makes our emotions so powerful, and why we feel them in the first place.
Yeah. You know, I think, first of all, emotions are, as James, as you said, they're very powerful things. I think also, one thing that is not talked about as much is like, what is the definition of emotion? Like, what is it? Like, is everything an emotion? Is everything not? And I'm like, what is it? I mean, I think a lot of that depends on the school of thought that you come from. Some research suggests that and argues that feelings that have a physiological response to them, which I, as another person, can see, then that is what constitutes as an emotion. Sociologists would say a little bit differently. They would say that emotions are socially constructed entities. And so when we think about how powerful they are, emotions have the power, when we talk about in our relationships, have the power to bring people together, but also have the same power to make people go apart. In society, emotions have the power to start movements, and they also have the power to incite division, right? And so I think that, that's really what's so powerful about emotion as a whole. It's a really fascinating area of study that I came across. And I'm excited to talk more about it.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point when you talk about emotions on the individual level and then emotions on the societal level. And we're actually going to get into that in our next episode with also soon to be Dr. Rob Matheny. We're going to talk about intractable conflicts, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The big thing that I want to focus on that you mentioned is the physiological element of emotions. The past 2 episodes that we've been featuring on this show have adopted the bioevolutionary approach, where we talk about the physical needs and the physical reactions that we have to emotions. As I look here at my little cheat sheet, there are a ton of biophysical indicators associated with emotion. I mean, we're talking about things that we've heard of. Like, we've heard of dopamine. Last week, we talked about things like oxytocin. But then there's also things like adrenaline, neuroadrenaline. You have your endorphins, your serotonin, your cortisol. And then there's some words here that I really just can't even pronounce. Glutamate, acetylcholine, GABA, and a variety of others. And so what happens is when we experience an emotion, there is an evolutionary need that people have to experience that emotion. And there's a biological reaction that we're not necessarily in control of that happens when we experience an emotion. And then what happens is we need to express that emotion when we feel it. So, first of all, how do we tend to express emotions, and what happens if we try to express an emotion and it's either not received well, or maybe we don't know how to express it? How does that affect the way that we live our lives?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the way we tend to express emotion, I think that question could be sort of thought about at a more cultural level. It could thought about, different, hemispheres and things like that. I think also when we talk about emotions, let's just say we're talking about here in the United States, period, right? Mm-hmm. I think we are socialized to express emotion. We're socialized to express, I think, our negative emotions more so than our positive ones. And I think part of that is based upon the notion that it's harder to understand the reason why somebody's happy. And it's easier to understand why someone is expressing like anger, for example, right? And I think part of that deal is from the cognitive lens. It takes more work to figure out, why somebody is happy. Because as human beings, we don't necessarily have to have any justification for why we're happy. As much as everything is pleasant, everything is fine, but there are more consequential reasons for why we get angry, right? And so I think when it comes to expressing emotions, we have that sort of deal, at least in the United States. In terms, right? Other countries and other parts of the world have a different orientation to it. And I think in other places, in let's say Eastern cultures, for example, the emotions associated with like things like uncertainty, they look a lot different and they're expressed a lot differently than how we do them in the United States. So, yeah, I mean, I think, there's different approaches to it. There's different ways, but yeah, we all do express emotion. I think that is clear. Unless you are stoic, you believe in that philosophy of not expressing emotion, that emotions don't bother you, they're not a thing, which is completely false. They are a thing. And so, yeah.
Yeah, so they're very powerful. They definitely vary by culture. Now, we all experience the emotion, but like you were kind of alluding to, we express them differently depending on our own upbringing and our own culture. And I appreciate the the focus that you had on the negative there. We talked with Dr. Corey Floyd 2 weeks ago about a little bit about toxic masculinity and one of the ways in which men can do things like express affection without feeling quote unquote feminized or threatened in any way. But unfortunately, you're right about the negative emotions. It's much easier to decipher those emotions and to explain those emotions. And like I tell my students regularly, people are pretty selfish when it comes to their mental energy. We don't like to expend it. And so when we encounter something that requires a lot of unpacking and critical thought, we kind of stray away from it. So I think that that's a good point. And when we don't express these emotions, there's a variety of negative outcomes. And then, of course, on the other hand, if we're too expressive about our emotions, we can encounter some issues as well. So I think you know where I'm going with this when I ask, what happens if we are perhaps the type of person who isn't really in control of the way in which we express our emotions? What happens if we are too expressive with those emotional reactions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can. I think the world we're living in today sort of exacerbates this point, right? Of like, when we're not in control of our emotions. I mean, I think about sort of, again, at the societal level, how one individual can cause a division, right? It can start something. You can probably guess who the individual is I'm talking about. But how one individual who does not have much of a filter in terms of how they express their emotions can help change people's attitudes toward things and toward other people. That can foster riots. It can foster unrest in a country, right? And so when you think about that, about how powerful it is, when we are not in control of our emotions, I think assume outside of any medical conditions, right, that we can be in control of our emotions and how we express them. I think a lot of it is dependent upon if we want to. Again, outside of any medical conditions, right? So when we think about that, that's just what we can control them, right? But I think sort of a point to move forward in is, I think we have to start teaching the younger generation about, like, in grade school, about emotions and how to express them. And I think at the individual level, what can happen again is, like, people's relationships can die off because of it. Marriages will end because of it. And part of a lot of the reason why people get divorced is because of that communication aspect, which we all know, right? Right. That communication piece, and part of that is expressing emotions. What does it look like when your partner gets mad or upset and angry? What does it look like? Like, what does it look like? Does it look like throwing things across the room? Well, that's not good, right? Does it look like stomping out, leaving the house, and not working out the issue? That's also a problem, right? And so, that's just a fundamental question. What does it look like? But I also think on the opposite end, too, with, like, positive emotions, how we express them, too. I mean, there's some research that suggests that people do not like others who are always expressing their positive emotions, like, who are always happy.
That one dude who's too happy, it's raining outside and there's a deadline at 3:00. Why are you smiling, Chuck?
Right.
Stop smiling.
And why is this person always so happy?
Right.
And I think the same is true on that end too. It can cause people to not feel good about themselves too.
No, I think you make a great point. We do experience emotions, and we also, as people, have the desire to express them. But there comes a time where, if we're feeling badly, that's a valid feeling most of the time. But we also need to control how we express it around other people, because, as we're about to unpack here, your bad mood can bleed over to me and ruin my day. And then, on the other hand, if you're feeling great and I'm feeling like crap, and you have the power through your expression of emotions to lift me up, which of course begets a conversation about emotional contagion. So if we move on to that, tell me what emotional contagion is and why it's important, and maybe some of the risks and benefits that we encounter when we see it.
Yeah. So at a fundamental level, emotional contagion is the spreading and transferring, and by that same point, catching emotions, right? And the feelings of others in our social vicinity, right? And essentially what that means is, I'm talking to you, you are, feeling and expressing emotion, a particular emotion or a set of emotions. And during our conversation, I start to feel that way too, right? And again, going back to the emotions being so powerful piece, right? What happens when people spread emotion is that, they a lot of times what occurs is emotions that are the most intense are the ones that are able to be caught the most, right? So thinking about anger. Anger is one of those intense emotions.
Mm-hmm.
Happiness as well. Or excitement. You could say that excitement is one of those. And that's an easy one, right? You could imagine just going to a rave or whatever and all the excitement that occurs at a rave.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what's important. But again, in the relationships though, right? In your relationships, it has the power to, like you said, ruin your day. Thinking about the situation in which we're currently in with the COVID, people living at home together, folks who are not leaving the house to go to work necessarily, who are in the house all day, every day with each other, right?
It's stuffy in there.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So when we see it, I think it has that ability to spread and manifest itself. And I think, so why is it important? Well, I think, again, it is important at a societal level because it can create peace. It can also create division.
Yeah.
And I think right now we're kind of seeing a lot of that.
Yeah.
And I think the good part though is, if you think about a lot of the events of the summertime,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
The murdering of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others.
And the subsequent protests that followed. Yeah.
Yeah. And you think about a lot of that. I think what continues to, I think we've seen a lot of people who were not outraged before become outraged now. And I think that just has a way of spreading, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's another fundamental question when something is, how can bad emotion spread for a good cause?
Right.
I think that's sort of a question I don't think many people have answered yet. As I think of it, no one has answered yet.
It's a tall order. That's a tough question. Yeah.
There is a tough question, right? But I think there are plenty of examples in society that helps us to address it.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that goes to like the complexity of emotion and how just unique it is as a thing, right? It's not just that bad emotions have bad outcomes, mm-hmm. but what we would call bad or negative emotions having bad outcomes. They also can have good outcomes too, but vice versa as well. Right. And so that's the complexity of it. I think that's what's so powerful about it too.
Yeah, I think if we get cultural about it for a moment too, here in the States, when we're in a bad mood or when we're experiencing negative emotions like anger or sadness, we often think of them in respect to ourselves. And mm-hmm. we neglect the fact that when we carry a cloud like that around with us, everyone can see the cloud, right? And sometimes the cloud spreads and sometimes it rains on other people. And, like you were saying, one of the big things that we need to do is be aware that it's happening with the negative, and then of course also with the positive. So it looks like we're having a mild internet issue, but just to compliment out on that point regarding emotional contagion, it's important to note that when folks are experiencing negative emotions, right, if you can catch them as they're going through it, there might be a chance to either pull them out of it, or if you have to, pull yourself out of it. And in that moment, what you can do is you can prevent the spread. So I've actually got one of these little masks sitting next to me, one of these little masks. So when we think about COVID and how can we prevent the spread of COVID, right? Well, a lot of folks are saying that the right thing to do is to wear a mask. When it comes to preventing emotional contagion, we need to be able to harness our own, metaphorical mask as well. And so the final thing that I want to talk about here, as we desperately struggle to get Lance back on, the final thing, we got him. We got him. Don't worry, Lance. I know how to vamp. I took a bunch of improv classes in college, so
there we go.
We're good to go. Well, we were talking. What I wanted to get to in the last couple of minutes that we have here is, we know why emotional contagion is important, and the question becomes, like with the mask and COVID, how can we prevent emotional contagion from occurring? Assuming, right, if we think about it as being a negative experience, how do we prevent that from occurring?
Yeah, so I think it happens a few ways, right? So let's take the example of the mask, right? There are people who don't believe in wearing the mask, which causes some type of disgust associated with the mask. I think part of the deal is as individuals, understanding who is in our circle, and this goes back to a lot of your research about social networks, right? There are people who are more susceptible to emotional contagion than others in our social networks, right? So you could use it based upon relational factors such as direct family relatives, or your best friend compared to an enemy, of course, right? And so thinking about that, I think part of it is not just evaluating information, but evaluating who's giving information.
Right.
But also evaluating your role in receiving and interpreting that information. Because sure, my mother might tell me something, and assuming you have a good relationship with your mother, you would usually not question it twice, right?
Right.
Ideally, right?
Ideally.
But given the age in which we live in, I think we always have to sort of evaluate things 2 and 3 and 4 times. Not to put doubt on your mother's words, but from a perspective of benefiting not just ourselves, but other people in the social vicinity, right? Because when things continue to spread, whether we're talking about literal viruses or emotions, there's information that's stirred up with all of that. And I think because of social media and Twitter and things like that, information has a way of spreading so fast nowadays way faster than it did back when we were growing up, or when our parents were growing up. Right? It happens so fast now. So I think you just have to evaluate, who's giving information, but sort of again check 2, 3, 4 times to make sure that the information is correct, but also again to evaluate the information, the emotions associated with that information.
Right. I think that's a really good point, and I think you make a couple of good points, especially as it pertains to conflict with, for example, family members or loved ones or best friends, or people who we definitely have conflict with, but at times struggle to manage. And that's where we're going to pick up next week with our guest. We're going to talk a little bit about the most important conflicts that we encounter, and so in talking about that, the role of emotion is going to come up. So I'm glad that we had the opportunity to kind of say, hey, here are some things that you can do to avoid that spread of emotion while still getting the information across. So we are pretty much out of time. I want to thank my guest, Lance Bennett. Lance, it's been a pleasure having you.
Yes, sir. Thank you, man, for having me. I appreciate it. Thank you for all your work that you do with this stuff, man. This is important.
I'd like to think so. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Spotify, YouTube. Smash that subscribe button, folks.
You've been listening to Red Rock Relationships, a podcast about communication. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time. If you'd like to be on the show or have questions for us, please send us an email to redrockrelationships@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Just search Red Rock Relationships. Thank you again. And remember, it all begins with good communication. This has been a production from a podcast studio.